Welcome to Zestful Aging, where I interview inspiring, fascinating women who are navigating aging with class and sass. I'm your host, Nicole Christina. Hey everyone, I am so grateful for all of the downloads, and I'd love a rating on iTunes and a comment. And please subscribe. It helps the show's rating so other people can find it and learn how to age well. And if you are loving the podcast, why not check out the companion online course, Zestful Aging, Simple and Sustainable Habits for Health and Longevity. You can access it through my website, NicoleChristina.com/Zestful Aging. It's based on the Harvard study of adult development, and I'm really proud of how it's turned out. Well, I've got my coffee in my hand and my trusty dog Sparky beside me, so let's begin. Today we have the pleasure of speaking with Florence Williams, who's the author of The Nature Fix: Why Nature Makes Us Happier, Healthier, and More Creative, which the New York Times calls fascinating. The Wall Street Journal calls her writing exceptional, droll, and crisp, which makes her feel like a pastry. She's contributing editor at Outside Magazine, a freelance writer for the New York Times, National Geographic, among others. She's also the writer and host of a new podcast series, The Double X Factor, for Outside Magazine, a fellow at the Center for Humans and Nature, and a visiting scholar at George Washington University. Her work focuses on the environment, health, and science. A warm welcome to you, Florence.
Thanks so much, Nicole. It's great to be here.
I'm really excited to talk to you. As I've told you, I've so enjoyed your book, and I've been sharing some of your research or the research that you've talked about and uncovered in the book with a lot of different people, and it's particularly about the fractals, which I'm going to talk to you about later, but my circle is full of nature lovers. And so talking to them about the scientific aspects of that has been really interesting for them. And it's been fun to talk about.
Oh, great. Yeah, I love that.
So I'm curious, what was your favorite finding in this book?
I think that there were a lot of things I was expecting to find that I did. For example, that, when you're out in nature, it improves your mood, right? I mean, I think many of us have personal experience of that. I didn't necessarily need the science to point that out to me. But there were some other findings that really surprised me. For example, that seeing something beautiful or that something that fills us with awe can actually make us nicer people, can make us more generous and make us behave in ways that are more sort of socially and pro-socially minded, as opposed to kind of self-directed or self-involved. So there are a number of really interesting experiments that they've done in the laboratory and sort of out in the field, showing that if you take a group of volunteers to sort of gaze up at trees, for example, even for 1 minute, versus a group that you send to gaze out at a tall building for 1 minute, that those volunteers will then act in ways that are more generous, in the moments following that viewing. So that really surprised me. But in a way, it makes sense. When we see something incredibly beautiful and sometimes even, awe-inspiring, we may have a little bit of trouble comprehending it. I'm thinking of, for example, an incredible solar eclipse, that so many of us witnessed last summer. It's almost something hard to understand. And so naturally we turn to our community and we turn to people around us. And then also at the same time, we just ourselves feel a little bit smaller in the face of incredible natural beauty. We feel more connected to the world and interestingly, at the same time, more connected to other people.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that really resonates as a therapist. And when people will talk, even people who, you wouldn't really consider big, hikers or hardcore nature environmentalists, I will ask them if they're really struggling, what helps, and they will say nature, and it doesn't have to be fancy.
Right.
That's really been true. I'm curious if you think you would have been inspired to write this book had you not moved from Colorado to DC and experienced some of the nature deprivation that you describe.
Yeah, that's a good question. I think I would have gotten the assignment from Outside Magazine, that started this whole book, and that was to go to Japan and find out what scientists were seeing in terms of people's physiology, when they go forest bathing. So that was really the original assignment. So it's hard to say. I mean, I might have still been really interested in the science, but I think having the kind of personal experience of actually feeling the loss of nature so deeply in my own life really made these questions seem very urgent and important, and also really motivated me to try to write a book that could be helpful, for most of us who do, in fact, live in cities.
How's it been for you since the book's been published? Do you feel as though you found a sweet spot in terms of, getting enough nature? I know you talked about walking along the Potomac and finding some, parks. Do you feel like you found what you need?
I feel like I have made a lot of progress. DC is actually a city that's filled with greenery. So I'm fortunate in that we have tons of parks. We have lots of trees. I have a backyard. You might be able to even hear some of the birds in my backyard right now because they're sort of going crazy. I do walk almost every day out on the Potomac, and I do find very just healing spots of nature. What I don't really find in DC is the quiet. So in the book, I talk about how it turns out that I'm pretty sensitive to noise pollution, which is not something I ever knew until I moved to Washington, D.C.
With the jet noise,
Yeah, the
particularly.
jet noise particularly, but also things like leaf blowers and lawnmowers and home construction. When you live in these higher density environments, there's just all kinds of human-made noise. And so, I still feel that I have to get out of DC in order to get kind of a deeper, more immersive, higher quality, wilderness experience. And so, because I know that that's something that I need and yearn for, I do manage to go back to Colorado, pretty often. I'm about to leave next week. I'm going to go for a few weeks. And so it's just, I know now how important it is for me to find those places that are even more full of solitude.
I know this is a really tricky question and you can pass, but what does it feel like when you know you're not getting what you need in terms of a proper dose of nature? Can you describe the experience?
Well, I think some of it is just cognitive. Like I know that I'm working on some big questions about my life or big decisions I need to make, or I'm trying to recover, from whatever's going on, kind of emotionally. And so that's when I find myself really especially craving, a place that's got some solitude and some time and space for me to work through, whatever it is I'm dealing with. Sometimes they're creative challenges. I'm working on a book, for example, or a piece of writing. I'll know that I need to go out for a walk. And that's where I'm going to solve some of these problems. Or even more sort of notably, I need to go away for like 3 days to solve some problems in my writing. And I need to do that alone, and I need to really clear the decks from other distractions and interruptions. And if I can be in a place that's more filled with nature, I know that I'll have more success.
It's just predictable for you. You know it's worked again and again.
Yeah, I think it's just a certain amount of experience and also just what I kind of feel in my bones. It's like, oh, I need some fresh air. I need some quiet. I need to work this through.
Yeah, I can see that. Do you think it's important that if you are that kind of person who's sensitive to that and sensitive to noise, that you live with people or your family understands that aspect
Yeah,
of?
absolutely.
Uh-huh.
Absolutely. But I'm fortunate in that, my children also love being in nature. And
Wow.
we often go together. when we can. We go on hiking vacations, we go on camping vacations, we go on rafting vacations. So they totally get it. And, and they understand, too, that my work often takes me away, not just for kind of writing retreats, but because I'm a journalist, I'm just often on the road anyway, doing reporting.
Mm-hmm.
So it's just always been that way. And unfortunately, everyone's pretty accommodating.
Mm-hmm. Would you mind talking a little bit about the rafting trip that you were invited to take, which I'm sure was somewhat of an honor for the women vets who were really struggling with PTSD? Could you talk a little bit about what that was like?
Yeah, sure. In fact, I've done now, even since the book came out, I did a second river trip with a different group of veterans for my podcast that I'm working on. And again, it was a group of veterans with post traumatic stress. And what's so amazing and transformational to watch is that a lot of these veterans come on the river having not done a lot of adventuring, since they came back from war. Um, in many cases, when you have PTSD, you're sort of hyper vigilant.
Mm-hmm.
You hear a book drop and it sounds like gunfire. You want an environment that's very kind of low stimulation. And so it's hard to go out in public spaces. For many of them, it's hard to leave their homes, and they don't very often. And so to come on this river trip, is a big deal. And yet, when they're out in the wilderness, they have this kind of opposite response. Instead of wanting to shut their world out, it's so beautiful and it's so fascinating and it's so kind of sensory rich that they end up really opening up to their environment. And so they're looking at this incredible alpine glow on the canyon walls. They're watching the bald eagle soar overhead. They're paying attention to the rapid that's coming up on the river. They really start to come out of their shells. And then you see that happening socially as well, where, by day 3 or 4 of the river trip, there's a lot of laughter and singing, and people are telling me that they're sleeping better than they've slept in months. They form these friendships that then stay with them when they return home, and then they kind of support each other through the other kinds of therapies that they're doing. So it's very transformational. It was very powerful to see.
Mm-hmm. It just sounds like such a rich experience for you as an observer.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Very moving. It's
Mm-hmm.
very moving. And I've spent time even since then too with other people who've suffered even pretty serious trauma, emotional trauma, and have watched how being outside in the wilderness in a group has been so healing for so many people on so many levels.
Hello, Zestful Agers. A short intermission to thank you for the incredible amount of downloads. I love creating this podcast, and it's so satisfying to know that you are enjoying it too. Creating and hosting Zestful Aging has been a blast, but it does require a lot of time and resources to deliver a high quality interview to you every week. So I've signed up with Patreon, which is kind of like Kickstarter, but for ongoing artistic projects. Unlike Kickstarter, the donations are recurrent and the amount is usually smaller. When you become a patron of Zestful Aging, you will receive special benefits like behind the scenes info, a place to communicate with other listeners, as well as other patron only bonuses. These funds will be used to make equipment upgrades, particularly for mobile interviewing, and to travel to interview guests, like to New York City to interview participants in the Diversity Fashion Show. I also need to hire a professional editor. So please go to patreon.com/zestful aging and make a small but vital donation. Thank you for contributing to the ongoing success of Zestful Aging, and I can't wait to bring you more juicy, inspiring interviews. Now back to the show. And one of the things that I talk to other guests about and, know about through my own work is that being middle aged and over, it starts to get much more important to feel like you are having meaningful experiences and that your life has some purpose. And I wonder if is this something that fills the bill for you as a middle age or a woman of a certain age? Does this seem like it's an important part of your life as a woman, as a human being?
Yeah, I'm glad you asked that because I have been thinking a lot about life transitions
Mm-hmm.
and the role that wilderness has played throughout human history and culture, right? Of sort of rites of passage taking place in nature-filled environments. So many cultures, especially for adolescents, will incorporate some kind of nature-based rite of passage in which a group of young people is sort of isolated from their elders for a while, undergoes some sort of hardship or trial or transformation, and then comes back and is kind of
Mm-hmm.
welcomed into the community. And I'm just fascinated by that, how we've lost that in our culture.
Mm-hmm.
But I think that adolescence is only one of those transition points in life, and certainly middle age is another one. I think for both men and women. And I think being connected to nature, spending time in nature, you know, again finding those opportunities for sort of time and space where you can really think about who you are, what your identity is, how that identity may be changing, where you want to be in the future. The wilderness can really provide that for us.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'm just thinking about. I know your first book was about breasts and the uh, the consequences. I'm saying this very simply, but of pollution and toxins on breast tissue, and then this, and your work really has this far-reaching part to it, which is you do the science, but there it, there's such broad implications. It's such important work. Do you feel that? Is that something that excites you and makes you feel a sense of purpose?
Oh, absolutely, and thank you for observing that. I think it is true, and I tend to ask very big questions
Mm-hmm.
as a
Mm-hmm.
journalist. Like what is the human connection to nature? What should it be? How does nature affect our health and our well-being? Those are certainly big questions that I'm grappling with, and I think they're really fundamental, to how we live on the planet. They have implications not just for our health, but also for how we treat each other and also how we treat the planet.
Uh-huh. Yeah, if we would have known you in grade school, could we have predicted that you'd be writing about these kinds of things?
Probably not. I was a real city kid. I grew up in New York City. I love New York City. I love growing up there. I'm very comfortable in a city. Um, but I did spend summers with my dad canoeing, mostly out west and a little bit in the south and a little bit in Canada. So I always had this kind of dual personality where I was kind of wilderness girl for part of the year and then like total urban girl for the other part.
I see. Yeah. And now I guess DC is urban, but you're also trying to find some of the places that feel more green and more fulfilling nature wise.
Yeah, absolutely. Most of us live in cities. As I mentioned, more than half the people on the planet live in
Mm-hmm.
cities. Many, many cities have done a pretty good job of developing and building public spaces that are green, parks. Although I think, all of us could argue we probably still have a long way to go, especially in certain parts of cities, right? Right now, people who live in the wealthier neighborhoods tend to have plenty of trees, plenty of nice gardens,
Mm-hmm. Those beautiful old trees.
beautiful old
Right.
trees. The schools are sort of better landscaped. So I think access to nature is really a social justice issue that's been
Mm-hmm.
kind of overlooked. And you can actually see poverty from space.
I remember that part in your book, and I was just
Yeah,
floored by that.
yeah, it is shocking. If you look at a place like Washington D.C. from a satellite image, you see that there are parts of town that are plenty green and parts of town that are really kind of wastelands in terms of nature. So if we really believe that nature is fundamental for our human well-being and sort of optimizing, how we can recover from stress and be the best selves we can be, it really becomes a human rights question. How do we provide this access to everyone equitably?
Yeah, that's a really just a really profound thought. Do you want to talk a little bit about your new podcast?
Um, so I can't talk so much about my new podcast just yet, but I can tell you it will be
Oh,
out in September, and people can look for it on Audible.
okay.
And I've already made two other podcasts, and they're both available on iTunes.
Tell me about those.
Sure. One was based on my first book, which, as you mentioned, is about breasts. That podcast is called Breasts Unbound. Excuse me. It's called Breasts Unbound,
Ah.
and it's an 8-part series that looks at kind of the social and environmental issues associated with breast health.
Mm-hmm.
And it's funny, and we have a lot of great interviews with people in the field. I go to Oxford and I interview an evolutionary theorist there, and there's just lots of fun stuff in there for people who are interested in health and also interested in the environment. And then I did eight episodes for Outside Magazine's podcast about women in extreme sports and women in the outdoors, and that one's also available right now.
Is that the double X factor?
It is, yeah.
Okay.
It is. And that's really about women. And you can find links to all of these actually on my website, which is florencewilliams.com.
Okay, and I will put that up. Excellent. Can we just end by talking about fractals, please? That is my new favorite word. Could you tell the listeners what that's all about? Because I think they're going to want to notice it next time they go outside.
Yeah, sure. In my book, I interview a physicist who is really obsessed with fractal patterns. And he's an interesting guy. His name's Richard Taylor. He used to study art. And he loved Jackson Pollock paintings. And he learned that there are fractal geometries in these Jackson Pollock paintings. And then he started to apply that to other areas of his kind of more academic physics work. And basically what a fractal pattern is a pattern. Basically what a fractal pattern is a pattern that repeats itself at different scales. So I think you can imagine this if you're looking at a tree, for example. You would see certain patterns in the leaves that are replicated in the small branches, that are replicated in the large branches, and that are even replicated in the forest itself. Many fractal patterns are found in nature. They're found in waves, in coastlines, in clouds, for example, many different landscapes. And a number of scientists have found that when we view these fractal patterns in a certain dimension, that's sort of not too busy but also not too boring, our brain produces alpha waves. And it seems to put us in a really kind of happy zone. So, for example, I think we can all picture those screensavers where you have these geometric patterns sort of coming and going, and they make you a little bit mesmerized. And they can also sometimes increase your sense of focus or calm. And
is a spiral an
really
example of a fractal?
Yes, absolutely. There's
Okay.
there's one famous fractal spiral that was sort of mathematically discovered by Mandelbrot, who was the French physicist who came up with this kind of concept of fractals. And you can see that on the internet if you look it up.
Okay. Okay. Any last words you want to leave our listeners with in terms of what you have learned about nature and its way of helping us be more healthy and, in this particular case, age well?
I think that there's so many ways we can look to nature to help us through life's challenges. And certainly aging brings up many challenges. It also brings up many opportunities. And I think no matter what, we just want to be thoughtful and mindful about how we go through those changes. So I really encourage people to be mindful when they go outside, to pay attention to which kinds of landscapes really appeal to them. Some people are really attracted to, for example, oceans and beaches, and others are really attracted to forests or to trails, in canyons or wherever it is that your happy place is. Kind of know what that is, seek those places out, and then pay attention to how you feel in those places. I encourage people when they go for walks, really not to multitask, not to listen to their favorite podcast.
You're right, exactly.
Even if it's yours, Nicole.
Yes, I understand. That phone is a real tricky one.
It's a tricky one, and I think we all know we're a little more tethered to it than we ought to be. And then, also I encourage people to really think about engaging all of their senses when they're outside. So ask yourself some leading questions to help get you into that kind of frame of mind. So, what birds am I hearing? What fractals can I see? How does this tree smell? And what does this bark feel like on my hand? And just doing that has been shown by especially the Japanese researchers to really facilitate this kind of speedy stress response in which we lower our blood pressure, we lower our heart rate, we can drop our levels of certain stress hormones when we're in a pleasant natural setting, and again, really engaging all those five senses.
Yeah, that's great advice. I think that's a great guidelines for people who really don't, may not know where to start.
Yeah, and I also encourage people to start small. It doesn't have to be in the wilderness in Colorado. It can be just spending a little more time sitting in your backyard, seeing which birds are coming in, noticing the butterflies as they fly around you. You can find nature in very small urban settings.
Are you aware of this little study? And I can't remember more details except that it was a teeny little patch of grass, and this was in Manhattan. And somebody did this experiment, and they just came back to this little homely patch of grass every day and noticed how it changed day by day by day, every single day for a year. And it was a real exercise in mindfulness and this idea that it doesn't have to be, the whole rainforest or this, deeply intense nature experience, but even just this little scruffy piece of grass could bring some of those benefits.
And I think the more we do that, the more we sort of focus in a small space, the more powerful our observations can be elsewhere, right, throughout our day. So if we're sort of cueing our brains to notice things in nature, that can really help sort of up the awe factor, which is known to be really good for our emotional health.
I just want to say one last thing in closing. Part of the reason, well, I love the subject matter, but your sense of humor is wicked. And I'm sure you have heard that before. Have you gotten that feedback about the book?
Yeah, I really enjoy it when people can find the humor in my books. I write science, but I do try to make it funny sometimes because sometimes things are funny, and also I think they can just help keep people reading and keep people engaged. So thanks, I really appreciate that comment.
Yeah, no, that was sort of the icing on the cake for me because you already had me with the subject matter. So I've been singing your praises. So I just want to thank you again for such a beautiful book, and I love what you're doing in terms of really looking at the big picture, the human rights question in this, and how we share the good stuff with everyone. I really appreciate that.
Likewise, Nicole, I'm grateful for what you do to help bring these issues to a broader audience.
Thank you so much for joining us on Zestful Aging. I love to hear from my listeners, so send me an email at NicoleChristina.com and tell me what you'd like to hear more about. I would also greatly appreciate if you could hop on iTunes and rate the show. Ratings help other people find the podcast so I can share all these good, juicy interviews with others. I would also invite you to become a patron of the Zestful Aging podcast. Hop on over to patreon.com/Zestful Aging and consider making a small donation. you will be eligible for insider-only goodies and behind-the-scenes information, and it'll help you feel good knowing that you're contributing to the Zestful Aging podcast. I'll look forward to sharing more juicy interviews next week on Zestful Aging.